anybody who drives a car makes errors. The trouble with driving a ship is that the errors are much more likely to cause really serious trouble.
Many collisions occur because the officer fails to apply the collision regulations properly.
Most people think of a typical bump and scrape. There's some damage to the vessel and that's it. But you could be talking about complete loss of the vessel, completely blocking a port, causing tens of millions of dollars worth of pollution.
The ship is out of service for many months. The consequential losses for an owner can be very severe. And that's to say nothing about the risk of loss of life, personal injury.
A collision is a very horrific experience, especially the bad collisions. We've seen collisions wipe out entire ships, their cargo, their crews, and cause wide-scale pollution.
There have been several incidences around the world where masters and officers are being locked up or at least detained. Of course, you have to have the authorities' approval before they are allowed to go home. So if they don't give that approval, I'm afraid they might be there a very long time.
The master or the navigation officer is endlessly asking himself the question, what if? Only if I'd done this.
Today, the number of ships working around the world is greater than ever before, and the demand for new ones shows no sign of slowing, in fact, quite the reverse. Order books are full, even for shipyards which are still under construction.
420.
And with the demand for ships comes an obvious demand for the crews and officers to man them. The changes in the whole shipping climate over recent years have led to a shortage of seafarers, and particularly of experienced officers. That's good news for those looking for opportunities to work at sea, but there's a downside. As shipping activity increases, so too does the risk of accidents, and the potential for collisions is a particular concern. They don't happen often, but when they do, they can have devastating consequences.
So from every conceivable point of view, it's important that everyone at sea takes the whole subject seriously and does everything possible to make sure that collisions don't happen. These are the International Collision Avoidance Regulations. Their purpose is straightforward: to provide a complete code to avoiding collisions at sea. If every watch-keeping officer followed these to the letter, there wouldn't be any collisions. In theory, at least. In fact, in each of the last few years, there have been thousands of collisions worldwide. Thousands of lives have been lost and many people have been injured. The environmental damage has been significant, and in financial terms, the losses have run into billions. So something's still not right.
Ships, although they move very slowly, take some considerable manoeuvring over a period of time, and so you've got to avoid not so much hitting another ship, but ever getting anywhere near another ship.
So many things can cause ships to collide. Lack of training, equipment failure, the weather, unexpected events. But in the vast majority of cases, it's just human error.
I think if there is a concern, it may well be in sort of people's ability to understand and understand the meaning of the collision regulations and their implementation. And so that may be an area of weakness, perhaps.
All right, thank you.
Well, maybe it's lack of experience, and that could be exacerbated by the shortage of seafarers we mentioned. A newly qualified officer, for example, may get promoted straight up to the rank of the certificate he's just been given. So it's possible that some quite senior officers have had less sea time than they would have had in the past.
Years ago, when individuals were qualified as a master, they could perhaps gain that qualification by the time they were 26, 27, but they may have to wait many years before they assume command of a vessel. Nowadays, the pressure for seafarers is such that individuals are being promoted to the rank for the certificate they hold quite early. And that's fine when things are going well, when there's no pressure. But when you get stressful situations, then the lack of experience and the lack of maturity can tell.
They may not have had the opportunity to develop experience of the kind of vessel they're sailing. The new ships may be bigger and faster than the ones they're used to. It all adds up to real pressure. Imagine the risk and stress of an officer who's used to working on a general purpose bulk carrier with a service speed of 13 knots, who suddenly finds himself on the bridge of a 13,000 TEU container ship, cruising speed 26 knots.
There is already an existing problem with attracting good quality and experienced crew to ships. There's a massive number of ships on order, new ships, and we wonder where the crew are going to come from for that. And so we see the risk associated with collision as something that's going to potentially increase.
As with everything else, today's ships are more complex, with a variety of steering systems and new navigational, electrical and mechanical equipment and fittings, all of which present extra challenges for the crew. You need to know your ship and its technology. So all these factors suggest we should maybe remind ourselves of why collisions happen and how to avoid them. There are 4 main areas of concern: poor lookout arrangements, not proceeding at a safe speed, failure to assess the risk of collision and understand the situation so that you know what action you need to take, and finally, not reacting early or positively enough.
As you know, most of the steering and sailing rules apply to vessels in any visibility, but remember there's a clear and important distinction between vessels in sight of one another and in conditions of restricted visibility. We'll deal with those later. Let's now take the first of the 4 on our list: inadequate lookout arrangements.
Every collision is different, but there are some common threads. For example, lookout. Many collisions occur because the navigation officer fails to keep a proper lookout. And by that I don't mean that they simply fail to notice the other ship. That does sometimes happen, but there are very few collisions that occur because they simply fail to see the other ship. Generally speaking, the collisions occur because the officer on watch fails to monitor the other vessel properly and continuously on radar or by sight.
That's dealt with in perhaps the most important of all the rules, Rule 5. Every vessel shall at all times maintain a proper lookout by sight and hearing, as well as by all available means appropriate in the prevailing circumstances and conditions, so as to make a full appraisal of the situation and of the risk of collision. Straightforward enough, keep a proper lookout through 360 degrees. Sight and hearing, plus all available means, take account of the prevailing conditions. Follow all of that and you'll always be in a position to assess the situation and anticipate any possible risks.
People spend too much time looking at their instruments and not looking out of the bridge window.
There's no substitute for old-fashioned eyesight and the basic physical equipment they have, compasses, etc.
Nearly 50% of accidents, the one vessel had either not seen the other vessel at all until the collision had occurred, or had seen it so late that was unable to take any meaningful avoiding action.
The modern equipment is very useful. It can certainly be of benefit in certain circumstances, but I think there is a problem if one tries to over-rely on it.
If you haven't seen the other vessel, you can't apply any of the other rules. So Rule 5, lookout, in my way of thinking, is the most important of the collision regulations.
Circumstances change, so there's no single rule which can cover all situations, but lookout is paramount, and there are many factors which need to be taken into account. A number of basic principles can help establish the level of lookout required. Sometimes in daylight and clear weather, it may be possible for the officer of the watch to act as the sole lookout. But when any other factors interfere with this vital task, such as heavy traffic or navigation workload, radio communications, or if visibility worsens, he should call for assistance immediately and appoint a dedicated lookout. A dedicated lookout must also be appointed during the hours of darkness or at any other time when the officer of the watch believes it's necessary or is stipulated in the master's standing orders.
On a clear night, it can be very difficult to detect a ship's lights, which are perhaps only 2 or 3 lights that you see, navigation lights. against the background of a lot of landlights. Radar, of course, helps you enormously at that time, but on a clear night, the Dover Strait or the Singapore Strait can be very frightening.
Eyes and ears are still the most valuable resources for a lookout, so use them well and don't over-rely on other equipment. But as Rule 5 says, you must use all available means, such as binoculars, radio reports, AIS, radars and ARPA. They'll help to get the earliest possible warning of other vessels which might present a risk. Radar is critical and should be on all the time rather than on standby. Check its performance and keep checking it. The primary means of establishing that a ship is on a collision course is by determining its compass bearing, and not just a relative bearing. If it stays constant, a risk of collision exists.
I think you find most junior officers are very competent on radar. They've had 2 courses and they know how to use it well. The problem comes if they make a misjudgment when using the radar, and there are a number of cases where this happens.
It's necessary to be aware of a radar's limitations. There are errors. They're fantastic instruments these days, but there are still errors inherent in the radar, and part of an officer's training is to learn what those errors are and to make allowance for them.
We had one passenger ship which had a very nasty incident. The officer of the watch thought that the passing distance was going to be well clear. Another ship called up and said, "Are you going to keep clear of me?" "Yes," he said, "I'm going to pass round your stern." Actually, the officer had made a misjudgment. He'd used a true motion plot instead of a relative motion plot, and there was a collision, but there was really nearly a very, very serious collision. And here was an officer who had made a judgment based on an erroneous assessment of what the radar was telling him. And so these things can happen.
Long-range radar scanning should be a routine part of watchkeeping procedure. It helps with early identification of targets that are potential risks. A knee-jerk reaction based on a single observation is a dangerous strategy, so give yourself as much time as possible to plot a target. Making decisions that are safe and effective is much easier if they're based on as much information as possible.
When it comes to lookout, good communications between members of the bridge team are essential. Everyone needs to know exactly what's expected of them and what actions to take. Often, in order to make their respective intentions clearer, watchkeepers contact other ships by VHF radio as situations develop.
There's nothing in the rules that say you should use the VHF. However, if you do use the VHF, and there's no reason why you shouldn't at appropriate times, then you must keep your conversation positive. First of all, you've got to identify the target you're talking to. It's not always easy, even in this day and age with the automatic identification systems. It's not always easy to identify the other target. But once you've done so, then keep the conversation positive. Identify the target you're calling, make sure he knows you, and then say, "I am taking this action." Finished. Don't enter into long conversations, and then next thing they're hitting each other as they're talking to each other, and which has happened.
Queen Victoria, Independence of the Seas, 769.
Independence, Victoria, good afternoon.
First of all, it must be done early, and secondly, there must be positive identification of the other ship. Otherwise, you shouldn't start doing anything. Thirdly, it should be used to reinforce the correct application of the rules, to confirm intentions and to confirm movement, and then that's that. If for any reason it's going to be used to create a manoeuvre which is against the provision of the rules, but for one very sensible reason, there's a lot of traffic in one direction and it's sensible to go this way, etc., then we say the master must be on the bridge and the master must make that decision.
Roger that. Thanks very much. We'll be standing by in 16. Have a good watch.
But remember, the requirements of the collision regulations are supreme at all times. If everyone's keeping a proper lookout, each vessel should already know what others in the vicinity are doing, because they can see what's happening, and use compass bearings and radar plots to check movements.
VHF conversations have sometimes led to confusion and misunderstanding. There's also the embarrassing possibility that perfectly clear messages may be exchanged between the wrong ships, leading to even more confusion. It really does happen sometimes. AIS should help minimize that problem.
I don't think AIS was ever meant to be an effective tool for avoiding collisions. It can lead to mistakes. We find that some officers don't bother acquiring the target on the radar because the AIS data is available to them. But AIS can have errors.
The important thing with the technology is for the individuals using the technology to understand not just the ability of the equipment, but also its limitations.
I think there's a saying, is it garbage in, garbage out? So if the speed input or the heading input is incorrect, coming from an incorrect source, then the information coming out for anti-collision purposes would also be incorrect.
Nowadays, professional crews may be drawn from many different nationalities and have varying competence in spoken English. Shipping, of course, is an international business, and although officers must have achieved a particular level of proficiency in English, often it won't be their first language. If you're on a potential collision course and under a lot of pressure to make important decisions and act quickly, the bridge team needs to be able to communicate with confidence, precision and speed, and you need to be sure you're being understood.
It really is quite a problem now, multiracial crews, and we also see a situation between, say, for example, Eastern European and Western European. Eastern European, perhaps sometimes reluctant to challenge what the master's doing, challenge what the pilot's doing. They'll sit there rather subservient, and of course a dangerous situation could develop.
That will be tax line. This will be, I think, in 5-10 minutes, and now we are waiting for instruction from captain. But first of all, you must remember that safety is first.
With the multinational crews, you might, for instance, have a junior officer who is monitoring a master, say, who has the con of the ship. But he may be extremely reluctant, because the master has the same colour hair as me, to turn around and say to him, "Sir, I think something is wrong here," where his duty as a watchkeeping officer is to question whoever has the con of the ship, question that person if there's something he does not understand. Equally, there would be some masters or senior officers who may take issue with a junior officer who has the temerity to raise this matter, and that really is something that should not happen.
Mobile telephones are temptingly convenient, but they can be a dangerous distraction. One officer on lookout, for instance, noticed his phone had a signal as he was approaching land and responded to it, and was happily chatting to his wife on his mobile as the ship ran aground at about 18 knots.
Yep, St. Helen, the Adrian Mouse.
Other examples have seen pilots talking to each other on mobile phones rather than using the VHF. The result? The vessel traffic monitoring people have no idea what's being said, and the officers on the bridge can't hear what the pilot on the other vessel is saying. Pilots must make sure that the master and officers know exactly what they're doing.
We don't like to use mobile phones for communicating with other ships. For example, if I was concerned about the movements of the Red Falcon right now, if I called him on his mobile number, which I do have, and said, how do you fancy, passing green to green or something like that, then we're the only ones who have that knowledge. If I do it on Channel 12 on the VHF, then everybody in the area will be aware of what our actions are.
What we'll do is we'll start counting down when we're 5 cables from.
The other point to note about pilots is that when they're on board, the master and officers must still follow their passage plan, and the pilots are part of that. You can't just pass control and all responsibility over to him. He has to be part of the bridge team and be clear about the vessel's characteristics, especially if there's something unusual about them. He must also know what's expected of him.
We are what they call a clear channel status vessel, and nothing's supposed to be in the channel while we're in there.
There's no substitute for experience, and the more time you spend at sea, the better you should be at deciding how and when to act. But familiarity breeds contempt, and with experience often comes complacency. If you're doing a regular run between 2 ports, it's easy to become blasé. You can let your guard down, let your mind wander without being aware of it. It's easy, it's natural, and it's very dangerous.
There is a tendency, I think, for officers to be promoted into ranks at an earlier age than they have in the past. But in general, when we talk to officers, they know what they should be doing, but they're just not doing it. So I'm not sure that it's experience or, for that matter, training. We call it, we use the term complacency, which is quite difficult to define, but for some reason, despite the training, despite the ship's bridges having good equipment and good safety management systems, these things are not applied.
There's no room for complacency anywhere in lookout procedures. Many collisions and near misses happen in perfectly clear visibility and fine weather when the lookout becomes distracted. The officer of the watch is in charge of navigation and monitoring the port and starboard ARPA radars. The quartermaster is also on the bridge, but not on lookout duty. Suddenly, they hear the SAT-C alarm. The officer of the watch investigates, then telephones the master. They talk for about 5 minutes. The officer of the watch is sitting on the footrest of one of the chairs. From there, he can't keep a proper lookout. He fixes the vessel's position, then hears a call on the VHF radio. It's the deep-sea pilot of VLCC in the northeast traffic lane. He's warning him and Dover Coast Guard that he's passing too close. Suddenly, the officer of the watch realizes that he has 2 vessels close on his starboard bow. 1.9 miles away, the VLCC Apollonia, making about 16 knots, is being overtaken on her port side by a container ship, Maersk Vancouver, making about 21 knots. He begins altering course on the autopilot, then puts the quartermaster onto the wheel with instructions to maneuver between the two. In the end, they pass 5 cables ahead of Maersk Vancouver and 1 cable astern of Apollonia. While all this is happening, neither vessel shows on the port radar. Later checks will reveal that it was incorrectly tuned. If the officer of the watch needs to call the master to assist and advise, he should do so immediately. An extra seaman needs to be on standby to take over as helmsman if required. These are all procedures which should be clearly set out in the master's standing orders. They're an integral part of the bridge management system, and they must be understood and applied by all watchkeepers. Sentry Dawn holds course at 120 degrees to cross the westbound lane and enter the eastbound lane at an acute angle. Both radars are working properly. Slowly, she increases speed, and by 0427, making about 8 knots, she starts to cross the westbound lane. At 0330, Asian Energy is heading 260 degrees. At 0430, she takes a radar fix off land and alters course to 247 degrees. Later, the accuracy of this fix will be disputed. Visibility is good, both ships are using radar, and yet neither is aware that the other's there until they're about 1 mile apart on a collision course and in extreme danger. They both make emergency maneuvers, but at 0442 they collide. At the trial, the findings were that both vessels kept an incredibly bad lookout and should have seen each other on radar long before they did. The Sentry Dawn was also at fault for not crossing the traffic separation scheme at a right angle. The verdict was that Asian Energy was 60% to blame and Sentry Dawn 40%. The second item on our list of 4 was safe speed. Basically, a vessel must always proceed at a safe speed, and Rule 6 lists the factors you should take into account in deciding this speed in any condition of visibility.
Let me perhaps give you an example. If you're on, say, as I was, a cross-channel ferry or a ferry down to Spain, with 4 master mariners on the bridge, all the officers were master mariners, including, of course, the master himself. They're all extremely experienced. That's one thing, and the ship is highly maneuverable. It could stop from 21 knots in 2 cables, 0.2 of a mile. Compare that to perhaps a container ship going at 25 knots with a very junior third officer on the bridge, just received a brand new certificate, and a master who's dog-tired because he's been effectively on the bridge for the last 24 hours. And there's no use calling the other people out because they're going to be very tired as well. That's that's an element of safe speed, which has to be taken into account by ship owners and, of course, masters.
Visibility is critical. If you can see to the horizon and you're in open waters, it may be possible to move along at full speed. But in restricted visibility, Rule 19 applies, and the vessel's speed should be adapted accordingly. Traffic density and weather conditions are equally important when it comes to choosing a safe speed.
Then there's your vessel's draft in relation to the depth of the water. A ship's handling characteristics can change dramatically in shallow water. Speed makes the changes even more noticeable by increasing squat and decreasing clearance under the keel.
Whatever factors are in play, slowing down gives you more time to think and assess the situation by reducing the closing speed of the vessels. However, if you do reduce speed, you need to make the reduction significant and do it early enough. The master may be understandably concerned that cutting the speed will lose time on the voyage and affect the planned schedule, but the gap between what's lost and what might be lost if you collided with another ship is a very powerful argument in favour of slowing down. It's clearly important that before they even leave the berth, the officers in the bridge management team should be familiar with the ship and have a clear idea of how manoeuvrable she is at various speeds and how quickly she can be slowed down. Just cutting down by a few knots might make her much more manoeuvrable and give you a great deal more control, which, in turn, will give you more time to assess the situation.
There are several ships that proceed at too high a speed, and the officer on the bridge, having been at sea before, I know this, that bridge officers are still reluctant to use the engines on the bridge. They fear that they might wake the captain in the middle of the night or wake the engineers in the middle of the night. But the fact of the matter is, using engines early will take the time pressure off and slow the ship down. So they ought to really use the engines properly.
The Wakuna is on the port bow of the container ship Vespucci, and each vessel detects the other on radar at a range of about 6 miles. According to Vespucci's master, his ARPA initially shows a target on the port bow, heading north at about 6.5 knots, shaping to pass ahead by about 8 cables. When it's about 1 point on the port bow, his ARPA shows that it's altered course to the northeast and stopped. The second officer takes over the steering. He doesn't alter course or reduce speed. Vespucci passes the target at about 1100. According to the master, he never loses the target, and it's never less than 2 cables away. He sees it astern, making about 2 knots, but a lookout on the port bridge wing sees nothing. The yacht is fitted with 2 radars, one of them a mini ARPA. The skipper disengages his engine to reduce speed. As a result, the yacht loses steerage and alters course. This confuses the master on the bridge of Vespucci. At 1100, the vessels collide. Vespucci strikes Wakuna on her port bow, cutting off the forward 3 meters and dismasting her. The yacht's skipper puts his engines astern to reduce the inflow of water, and the crew abandons ship. 5.5 hours later, they're rescued by a fast ferry. The master of the container ship isn't aware of the collision and continues on passage. Later, paint marks consistent with Wakuna's paint are found on Vespucci's starboard bow.
There are plenty of examples of collisions where speed has been the primary cause because it didn't leave enough time to assess the situation and take appropriate action.
If you have a fog case, a restricted visibility case, where speed is particularly significant, and significant because the faster you're going, the less time you're giving to your ability to react, and the less opportunity you're giving to the other vessel to react, and because speed is highly causative in terms of damage. Therefore, speed is, in a sense, the crucial ingredient probably in visibility cases or restricted visibility cases.
Another pretty obvious effect of speed is that the faster you're travelling when you hit something, the more damage you'll cause. If the whole thing ends up in court and the judge decides you are travelling at an inappropriate speed, your prospects could be significantly diminished.
if you have a vessel which is going at 16 knots in absolute thick fog, and the other vessel is plodding along, perhaps a little on the fast side at 5 or 6 knots, then you will award a greater level of contribution to the damage to the vessel that's going at 16 knots.
The more time you have to make decisions about your own vessel and to interpret the movement of others, the better your decisions are likely to be.
Sometimes the officer on watch fails to call the captain when they really should be doing that. Two minds are better than one, particularly when the other one is older and greyer. So they really ought to call the captain early, and the masters would appreciate being called early.
In my experience, the ships are happy to pass very close to one another, far too close in my opinion. If you look at the radar records from the Dover Straits, for instance, ships are passing just 2 cables 400 metres apart, large ships, when there's absolutely no need for them to be passing so close. The other factor in this the collisions that occur with ships travelling in the same direction in traffic lanes is that they tend to use waypoint navigation, that they all tend to use similar waypoints for their tracks, their planned tracks, so that they all find themselves bunched on one side or the other of the lane and overtaking very close distances. If you plan to overtake very close to another vessel, you've got to be pretty certain that the other vessel has seen you and that you're taking a risk in case something unexpected occurs. The other vessel may have a breakdown, a steering breakdown, or the other vessel may not have seen you and may make a navigational alteration of course. It's much safer to pass further away so that you've got more time if the unexpected occurs.
Just because you're already in a lane doesn't of course mean that you have right of way. Even if you're crossing a traffic lane, the rules still apply. The mantra is the same. If there's a risk of collision, the collision rules apply. Remember too that vessels in traffic separation schemes may leave them at any time. A target may seem to be passing clear, then it may alter course for navigation purposes and rapidly become a threat.
Rule 10 is the rule on traffic separation schemes, and they feel that because they're in a traffic separation scheme, they don't need to take avoiding action. They have a right of way, but that's not true at all. They need to take avoiding action just like any other vessel needs to follow the rules.
Remember, there are 4 main areas of concern: poor lookout arrangements, not proceeding at a safe speed, failure to assess the risk of collision and understand the situation so that you know what action you need to take, and finally, not reacting early or positively enough. Let's now move on to talk about what actions need to be taken to avoid a collision. The key message is that you must take positive action in plenty of time for it to have an effect. Whether visibility is good or bad, the other vessel must know what you've done. In restricted visibility, there may be a delay before they realise you've taken action because they need time to plot it. If you're in any doubt, slow down or stop to give yourself time to assess the situation. In fact, it may in itself be all that's needed to avoid a collision.
You are the stand-on vessel. You've seen the give way ship, and either it hasn't taken any action or perhaps it hasn't done enough. What next? Well, you've got to do something, and to make sure it's effective, you have to do it in good time.
To get their attention, blow 5 or more short blasts on the whistle. If there's still no response, anything you do then must be an exaggerated move, which is clearly visible to the give-way vessel. Remember, take effective action in ample time.
In many cases, the officer on the bridge will not assess the risk of collision properly. It's important to assess that risk properly, and then after that, take decisive action. That's the other area where we find a recurring theme. When action is taken to avoid a collision, that action is not bold enough, not large enough to prevent a collision. We find sometimes when an alteration, for example, to starboard is made, the officer on board nibbles to starboard rather than making a hard-over alteration to starboard.
But it doesn't end there.
You've done what you should in plenty of time, so there should be no problem. But you can't count on it. The other ship's already failed to do something it should have done. It may yet do something unexpected. So go on monitoring the situation until you're past and clear. In overtaking and crossing situations, there's a give-way ship and a stand-on ship. But when vessels are meeting end-on or nearly end-on, then both have to alter course to starboard and pass port to port. In this manoeuvre, as with all other actions, you must make your intentions very clear at an early stage, especially if the other vessel is fine on your starboard bow in a nearly end-on situation when the closest point of approach on your starboard side is rather too small for comfort. If you're in any doubt about whether you're an overtaking ship as opposed to in a crossing situation, assume you're overtaking and stay out the way until you're finally past and clear. Whatever happens, it's always the duty of the overtaking ship to take appropriate action to avoid a collision. If you're the ship that's being overtaken, you just have to take a compass bearing of the other vessel and compare it to your own heading. This will let you see whether it's more or less than 2 points abaft the beam to establish whether it's an overtaking or crossing ship. But it's not quite so simple for the other vessel. Even so, and this applies to all vessels, including those under sail, if a vessel thinks it's overtaking, it must keep out of the way as required by the rules. Things become even more complicated when more than 2 vessels are involved. A vessel may be the stand-on vessel with regard to one of the other ships and still be obliged to avoid the other. As ever, the need is to keep a good lookout, identify potential risks, and take the necessary action at an early stage.
It's mainly human error that causes most collisions, and as far as human error is concerned, the same basic causes come up again and again. It's poor lookout, inappropriate speed, particularly in restricted visibility, not taking early enough action to ascertain what's going on so that you can take the appropriate action, and finally not taking early and positive enough action to avoid a close quarter situation, because you should be avoiding close quarter situations, not just collisions themselves.
Rule 19, the conduct of vessels in restricted visibility, is totally different from all the others, but analysis of collisions shows this isn't always understood. The key point is that the rules in Section 2, which cover, among other things, overtaking, head-on and crossing situations, do not apply in restricted visibility.
When one's dealing in restricted visibility and Rule 19 comes into play, all the other rules aren't appropriate. One is just dealing with Rule 19, and it's a question of travelling at the appropriate speed and being extremely careful on the lookout, and when one does see a target, navigating with care until the risk of collision is over.
Clear weather concepts such as standing on and giving way no longer apply. The only actions allowed are those in Rule 19. In restricted visibility, you must have your engines ready for immediate manoeuvre. Radar plotting of any target is essential to determine whether there's a risk of collision or a close quarters situation developing. If it seems to be on a steady compass bearing, there's a risk of collision and you must take action in ample time. Any alteration you make should be significant, say 60 or 70 degrees, so that it clearly shows up on the radars of other vessels. If you hear another ship's whistle before its target has been identified and plotted, slow down to the minimum speed that will allow you to maintain control, unless you're certain there's no risk of collision. If you can't take early action to avoid a close quarters situation, you must reduce your speed to a minimum and ease past with extreme caution until you're finally clear. If the vessels sight one another during these manoeuvres, the clear weather rules apply. But if they pass out of visible range, you must revert to the restricted visibility rule again. Much of what we've been saying is merely common sense based on experience. But remember that officers can easily become complacent. If they're in familiar waters or situations and they've seen it all before, they may press on regardless and hope for the best. That's a very dangerous attitude that could give rise to substantial liabilities. The most important touchstone, I think, of liability is the question of which ship created the situation of danger.
What I do try and avoid is blaming the vessel that last had the opportunity of avoiding the casualty. The finger of blame that I like to point is at the vessel which created the situation of danger from which the other vessel didn't very successfully extricate itself. That's the crucial point, I think.
It's essential to keep a good lookout, proceed at a safe speed, and assess the risk of collision posed by other ships. Monitor the situation and remember that rapid and effective action is everything. Make your decision early and make sure other ships know what you're doing. Slow down, give yourself time to think and to decide what to do. Your crew, your colleagues, your passengers, the safety of your cargo and your ship all depend on you accepting the responsibilities you've been trained to handle. The regulations are there to help you. It's up to you to make sure they're applied and to bring your vessel safely back to port.